Hello and welcome to the RICS World Built Environment Forum webinar series. Today's session is in partnership with ASITE, who are our WebF lead tech partner. My name is Andrew Knight. I work within our Regulatory Standards and Thought Leadership Directorate with RICS, and my role is to look at the whole effect of data and technology right across the built environment. So over the next hour, we'll be looking at the theme from documents to structured data. Can cost and performance data transform construction? So an interesting topic that's very close to my heart when we look at the issues around getting data further built in natural environment in a fit state to drive improved performance. I'd like to introduce the panel now, one by one, if I may, giving each panelist the opportunity to speak and introduce themselves. So Nathan Doughty from ASITE, please do introduce yourself.
Thank you, Andrew. I'm Nathan Doughty, the CEO of ASITE. Originally founding CTO, been with the business for 20 years. Back to you, Andrew.
Oh, thanks very much. And Anne.
Thanks, Andrew. So I'm Anne Bentley. I'm a global director of Ryder Levick Bucknell. We are cost consultants, general consultants, project management consultants in the built environment. I also sit on the Construction Leadership Council, and I've been doing a lot of work in the sort of definition and measurement of value. And I think that there's a really close link between sort of how you introduce BIM and how you introduce value. So really looking forward to it. Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. And Mohammed Kasim, please do introduce. Welcome.
Thanks, Andrew. Mohammed Kassam, currently a professor of digital construction and engineering at Northumbria University, and I'm also chair of the International Committee of the International Center of Connected Construction. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And last but not least, George Mokhtar.
Good to meet everyone. George Mokhtar. I'm responsible for the technology division within TNT UK and also global head of BIM. And I actually co-chair the IC3 committee with Mohammed. So pleased to see you all.
Thanks. Well, thanks all of you for sparing some time. Now, as ever, we have registrations from, in this case, over 30 countries, and we always welcome your active involvement. So please do submit questions to our panel, as it really helps to bring the conversation to life. And if you're new to these webinars, you should see that you can submit questions really at any time during the question box on your screen. I'll pick them up as many as we can go as we go through the session and try and include as many as possible. And please do keep those questions coming. So without further ado, just a reminder that we will publish a recording and written summary of this webinar. So don't worry if you miss some of the points or want to really kind of review and have another view of this. So without further ado, Anne, I'd like to bring you on first, if I may, and pose this question. How widely are tools such as the higher dimensions of BIM actually being used in the construction industry now?
Well, I think just to set the scene, I mean, you know, what do higher levels of BIM mean? I take this to mean things beyond simply using models and objects, things simply beyond BIM level 2, which of course is now mandatory on government projects. And BIM level 2 is really where you have the ability to collaborate, the ability to exchange data, but you're not necessarily using the same model. I think BIM level 3, which is where you start to get to interoperable data, often using the same model, the fact that you then need to introduce data standards, you need to introduce it into a contractual framework, if I'm honest. And so at BIM level 3, you already see almost some barriers to entry, if you like, because it's a different contract structure, it's a different administrative structure, etc. But I think when you get beyond 3 is where you start to really see some greater complexities, actually, because of course beyond 3 is trying to use BIM for things way outside of design. So looking at scheduling, looking at the creation of social value, looking at whether or not you can use the same data to manage or ascertain cost, etc. And so, I mean, I think number one is that as you get to the higher levels, it demands much greater collaboration, it demands a much firmer contractual structure, and it probably at the moment demands considerably higher levels of investment, I would say, to make it work. And therefore, I would say that there isn't a simple answer to this, because differs in different industries, and it differs on different scale of projects. So I would say that in industries that have got big investment programs, so particularly things like infrastructure, then you are actually beginning to see some of these level 3 and beyond being quite well taken up and actually contractually enforced. Whereas if you look at what is nearly 40% of the construction industry, which of course is, as you know, renewals, improvements, maintenance, etc., I would say that very few of those are even at BIM level 2, unless they're actually absolutely forced to. And so really, I don't think we have a consistent picture either in you know, how well it's being used or indeed sort of how successful it is. But, you know, I think we are getting there. It is certainly moving forward. And what I think is really reassuring is we are now saying, often hearing people saying, but surely we can use the BIM data to do this, this and this as well. And I don't think I was even hearing that sort of conversation 2 or 3 years ago. So a way to go, but it is moving forward, definitely.
Good. And it's good to hear that kind of, as you said, it's that pull factor that people are actually beginning to say, look, I want to use this data for other purposes. Mohammed, if I could move to you, what are the drivers and barriers to the adoption of advanced digital tools?
I think like Anne said earlier, first of all, really, what do we mean by advanced digital tools? I think nowadays, many people are, you know, are referring to digital twin. So that's the way digital twin came to the built environment, and construction came very quickly, and I would say it generated a little bit of confusion. We have definitions of digital twin by the like of the Center of Digital Built Britain and others, but there aren't very specific definitions about what we mean by digital twin. If we talk to colleagues from computer science, they have a clear definition of digital twin. It's about integration and data moving between the physical and digital environment. We don't have that clarity in built environment. So currently, if you refer in your question, if you are referring to this kind of tools, I don't think adoption is at any advanced state within built environment. There are generally some application mainly about monitoring, observing what's happening in the physical environment through sensors. You might find applications that are more advanced in smart building and smart cities on high-value application in high-value areas like energy and security. The reason the uptake is low, there are many. One of the main reasons is really there is a lack of what I call it multiple influences coming in the same direction. So what I mean by that, the technology itself has to be perceived as beneficial by the construction industry parties. It has to be. It has to prove that's better than the system or process that's trying to replace or bringing something new. The benefit realization should be either democratized or incentivized. But what I mean by that, if you want to build a digital twin or a new process and you need data from someone else, that party who should provide you the data would ask, you know, what's the benefit for me in that? And then you have the client private and public push and employers in general. Last but not least, you know, like the digital twin maturity itself is low when it comes to construction applications. So there are lots of things that should happen really in from many directions, from technology provider, industry provider, and process stakeholder who are contractors and facility manager and so on, for it to really be adopted within the construction and built environment.
I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that point around different definitions. I suppose one of the barriers is perhaps the lack of clarity about what we mean by digital twins. And perhaps, do you think people are sometimes scared or intimidated by their sense that a digital twin has to be an incredibly sophisticated representation rather than perhaps a journey towards more and more sophisticated data sets?
This is a really very interesting question, Andrew. Yes, people are scared by the definition. People have in mind, you know, the big dashboard, production control room with sensors. I think we need to clarify that for the built environment and construction sectors. It doesn't have to be the big screens and all sensor and buttons. It can be really simple dashboard on a screen that bring you real insight about how the asset is performing. It enables you to send like actions and information back to the physical side to improve certain conditions. Yes, that's really interesting concept. Unfortunately, I would say we are getting into a situation the same way BIM was like 12 years ago. There was a total confusion around what BIM is. We are living the same situation with digital twin, and it's not helpful.
No, indeed. Thanks very much. George, if I could move to you. What processes should companies wishing to transition from unstructured to structured data follow?
Lots. The interesting part of this question for me is that I don't think there's a specific process. There's just lots and lots of different work streams and a general approach that people need to take. So, I mean, for me, first of all, it's understanding and recognizing that unstructured data is a problem. So we had some interesting stats from the government, the NIC report, for instance, which suggests that there's about £7 billion worth of productivity a year lost through unstructured data just in the UK infrastructure sector. So that's just a little start. But the way that we always approach this is to assess, adapt, and advance the way that people operate. So you need to start off by assessing and understanding what your own digital maturity is. If it's an organisation, a major project or programme, whichever level you're working at, actually understand what your maturity is, where the issues lie, what your operating model is, what your business model is, and what that information needs to look like to have value. And defining that value is the key bit that a lot of people often overlook when they're trying to structure data. They just try to get it to work and to flow and don't actually think about which are the key points whereby it provides and presents the most value to the business. So once you've done that, you can sort of line up your business architecture, your information architecture, the applications and the data that sits beneath it. And then that enables you to adapt the way that your business work. So those interventions might be putting applications, tools and technologies in place. We mentioned ASITE earlier. If it's a project, that's a sort of tool or system you can put in place that gives you that forum for your data. It might be that you want to change the behaviours and the culture across the team. That might be the problem. So for instance, my go-to is always that you'd rather be a learn-it-all than a know-it-all. And you do tend to get a lot of sort of fixed mindset behaviours on these projects. And then also people thinking, historically the way contracts are set up, I am here and I'm appointed to deliver a certain amount of data, some information and some deliverables. And I do often call back to an argument that I once had with one of my suppliers years ago. And he basically said, well, look, I've got 20 things to upload and I can save 5 minutes per thing if I just get it on the system. And that's my deadline met. And actually just sitting people down and educating them to the fact that 50 or 60 more people might have to look for and access that information. So you're saving 5 minutes, but you might be costing hours for every single piece of information that you upload. So really just helping people move from my deliverables to I'm providing information that sits as much broader part of a landscape is really important. And the last piece, the advanced piece, this is definitely the bit which consultants usually miss off. They'll come in there, here's your roadmap, here's your strategy, your business case, let's get it deployed, there's the systems. And people quite often overlook the fact that you then need to embed those habits, those cultures, and make sure that there's that rigor and governance around the data long term, because as soon as you don't trust the data, the whole system falls down. So there's lots and lots of different work streams that you can point at, but as a general approach to take a stand back from the whole situation, my advice is to assess where you are, understand where you want to get to, understand the value you're trying to achieve through structure and data, stick to the standards, try and be open source, try and make the most of the low code software that's out now, and things like Power Apps, etc., that are huge advancements that can sit alongside the various things you can get from vendors. Make sure that your business is adapted in terms of the cultures, the behaviors, the systems, the tools, the contracts, standards, and then lastly, make sure that it's not just a thing that you do, but it's a culture that you embed and that it's a long-term, a long-term way of working and that becomes business as usual. So that's my sort of overarching response to how companies should transition. But I appreciate that there's a million moving parts that sits beneath that.
Indeed, indeed. Thanks, George. Before I move on to you, Nathan, actually, I've got a question from the floor, which I perhaps might put to Anne just to clarify, actually. And the question is there a difference, talking about BIM here, is there a difference between dimensions and levels? And did I hear that BIM levels were superseded in the new UK BIM framework?
So, to be absolutely honest, you probably need to ask somebody who's more in the nitty-gritty of BIM on this. So, I was specifically looking at the old definition of levels, and I do accept that that has now moved on a bit. In fact, I think there's far more than there were. So I was looking at the sort of Mark Bew BIM maturity, sort of going from 0 to 3+, if you like. Yeah. However, what I was talking about, I don't think it matters what you call them, because I was really talking about taking it from the basic sort of collaborative design tool, which I think is reasonably well used now, certainly on government funded jobs and certainly on infrastructure, to really using the philosophy of the tool and the capability of the tool to be looking at all the other facets of the built environment. So the cost, the social value, the scheduling, and the environmental impact. So I don't think that the sort of title of it is quite as important as where we are and where we're trying to get to, but I do accept I'm a bit rusty on the.
Don't worry, I wasn't trying to catch you up, but no, I think that's a fair point. That the main thing to think about is those issues of cost, time, sustainability, performance management. Those are the kind of use cases, aren't they? And that's the important piece.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. So yeah, so moving on to Nathan. You know, when you are transitioning from this unstructured to structured data that George has just talked us through, how can companies ensure the quality and integrity of that data?
Yeah, I think you've got the next question up on the screen there, Andrew.
Yeah.
But, yep. So yeah. So first of all, a lot of what George said is like verbatim, translatable to this question. So I'll try to differentiate a bit. And in fact, I'm sure you're reading my notes, George. But I mean, fundamentally, so I've spent the last 25 years effectively, wrestling with the problem for construction companies and asset owners and operators, government and private, with how to structure data. And that's the whole, we've talked about design collaboration systems and BIM and digital twin, and Anne has talked about, effectively what is the continuum of the BIM ramp, as we talked about it, 20 years ago. Which from level 0 and up to structured CAD, and then into parametric objects, and fundamentally there's lots of data out there, right? And it's increasing all the time. When George says unstructured data is a problem, which is true. Yeah, how do we address that? One, we start to try and apply meaning, or we create an ontology, and label the data that we do have with, meaning as to, so that's the whole essence of BIM. This is not just 4 lines on a sheet of drafting paper, it's a window. And now that we know it's a window, we can do things with it because we know how a window should behave in theory. And we can then attach, other non-geometric data to that. And that's the whole essence of where we're all trying to get to. So you have unstructured data sitting in documents, drawings, which are not, parametric. You have all sorts of things. You can do a number of things, which is first of all, get a plan in place, and create what you really need, and what BIM really is from a systems perspective is a database fundamentally. And the database is simply something that allows you to query the data that's in it, right? So you can then, do more with it than just look at it, right? And you can derive further meaning and analytics. So systems like ASITE and others have been on this long journey of helping to take, okay, we've got, starting with documents, right? Just drawings and document. Early in the early days, we were really focused on document management because that's where the data sat, right? And we said, well, the first thing we can do is manage the flow of documents through the project team and through the supply chain, and help to add metadata to it as it moves around, right? And that metadata becomes, structured data about the content of the documents. The documents are still black box, right? But then you can do other things like start to index and there's a lot of intelligent technology nowadays in systems like ours and others, where you can actually start to derive and pull meaning out of this unstructured data. It can be a bit messy, and there's a lot of human involvement still to check it, but it's that's one important avenue of pursuit. And then when we know that this is a problem, and we set out a plan, as George said, and we lay out standards around not just not just the content of the model and the content of the design and the content of the commercial and cost information around that design, but around also how we communicate together, right? And that's the whole essence of what we spent. I was heavily involved in BSI and the IAI for many years, and in the standards committees that eventually turned into the ISO 19650 and all the related standards. And that's all about how we communicate, really fundamentally, and agreeing a common language, or if not a common language, at least some common parameters as to how we're going to label the data exchanges that we have. So if I can, and there's a lot to talk about, and planning, having a plan, putting a database of some sort, and that can be a relational database, a common data environment, it can just be tagging information or just a file store. That's important, and then enforcing that. And the enforcement part is the biggest trick of all, obviously, because you need systems, but more importantly, you need people and process to be bought into that. And there's a lot of talk, always has been, and it's true, about this only happens ultimately when the top of the supply chain, i.e. the client, ultimately mandates it contractually. And here in the UK, particularly in government, but increasingly in private sector, that is the case, and also increasingly across other geographies, like in the Middle East, where we do a lot of work. That's happening as well. So I'll close it there. I think the next question
kind of leads on, as you say, Nathan. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that need for human intervention still, which I suppose highlights something you similarly see where people have been trying to develop tools to do lease abstraction, where you still need that human element for the kind of 20% of the data that needs to be sort of supervised in that way. And I suppose it's a similar theme, that we still need these professionals to look at the data that's being abstracted from documents to make sure that quality and integrity is still there.
Yeah, absolutely. People are critical to this. We're not yet anywhere near the point where artificial intelligence designs and builds our buildings and our infrastructure for us. And I don't see that happening in any of our lifetimes. We're still integral to the process.
That's good to hear. So leading on from that, Nathan, how well established are these digital data standards, and are we seeing the kind of interoperability between systems that's clearly required here, given the degree of collaboration for this kind of advances?
Yeah, I mean, that's a minefield of a question, because the reality is that construction is the most disparate industry on the planet, and that's why it's often said that construction lags behind in terms of technology adoption compared to many other industries like manufacturing and aerospace and all sorts of them. I argue this is wildly false. In fact, that construction is years ahead. The problem is that in aerospace, you've got 3 or 4 major players globally. In automotive, you've got 200 or 300. In construction, we've got literally millions of clients, right? So if you take the absolute number of companies adopting advanced technology, I think it's the largest industry by far. But percentage-wise, it's because of the structural reasons. So now interoperability and standards, many companies and many from all sorts, and practitioners as well as vendors, like ourselves, have spent many years pushing standards. It's often said, and we joked about it before the call, before the panel, that the good thing about standards is there's plenty to choose from, right? And thank you for that, Andrew. So the truth is that standards are being adopted, and those kind of collaborative working standards, like I referred to before, like ISO 19650 and others, are being widely adopted, and increasingly so, because they have evident utility, right? When they get adopted and they work and provide value, people see that, and this is a no-brainer. With regard to standards such as like IFC, for example, or industry foundation classes, which are designed to standardize the input and output of geometries between systems, it's a bit more difficult. And the reason for that is because, albeit they are widely adopted and widely used, the state of the art and the kind of rate of innovation that's occurring within the BIM authoring tool sets and engineering analysis tool sets and all the other tool sets that you use is sky high. So by definition, all of the companies that are pushing the envelope with innovation in those tool sets are ahead of the curve. And a standard, that's looking at hundreds or thousands of different tool sets that it needs to try and accommodate, is always going to be, by definition, if not quite a lowest common denominator, pretty close. Because IFC or COBE is going to work broadly, has to support what they all support, and they're all. So I think there's a structural, like, kind of 20+ year cycle going on, where at some point the BIM authoring tool sets are going to get to a point where they've tackled all the major problems. The standards will catch up, and then the standards will be widely usable, right? But now today, if you're an infrastructure engineer and you're trying to move something into IFC and share it with a colleague, it doesn't work, fundamentally. It just doesn't, because and that people have to use, therefore, the vendor black box tool sets. And that's a reality. That's just the way it is. So that's the way that it's happening. What we see, which is on the positive side, in the short and the medium term, in terms of integrations, is the kind of rise of ecosystems. And we're, ASITE is heavily pushing, that agenda. For us, it's about, opening up, we as a player, as a common data environment, sitting between all the different players. We're not, we don't own any data, right? Our customers own all the data, and the whole real, we think of ourselves as librarians or post office people, right? post people. Our job is simply to receive data, audit it, store it, and move it on, right? And then ultimately keep a track, a record for the project team about that. And the value in that increases exponentially with each connection that you bring to other systems across the ecosystem. And that's very important. And I think the industry sees value in that.
Yeah, as you say, it's almost that kind of data flywheel effect, isn't it, where you get that almost exponential growth of value when you do that. So thanks, Nathan. Back to you, Anne. It's a well-used phrase, I think, almost arguably politically in some respects, this build back better. But how do you see digitalisation helping us build back better and on budget, dare I say it?
So I think it's a really interesting one, because I think digitalisation is one of a group of tools that will actually assist us in this, but it isn't the sort of, it isn't the sole solution. And in fact, I suspect that digitalisation is rarely the sole solution to anything, actually. I think a lot of what we've already heard about behaviours, about ecosystems, about collaboration, unless you've got all these things as well, then digitization, will allow you to get to a bad solution quicker, possibly. But that's maybe the only thing it will do, and it might not even do that. But I was sort of thinking about this, and I think that there are 2 or 3 absolutely fundamental places where the use of sort of digitally enabled designs, the use of digital technologies, if you like, really can push things forward massively in this area. So for me, what Build Back Better actually means is that we are using the economic power of the construction industry to add wider value. So whether that's social value, environmental value, value to individual human beings, whatever, but it's value beyond the actual functional performance of the asset. So if we're building a railway bridge, clearly it has a functional performance because you can get across the river, but actually it also creates jobs, it should assist environmental progress, etc., etc., etc. So my definition of Build Back Better is that for every pound that's spent, we absolutely maximize the added value beyond the functional performance. And so if you look at it like that, and the really big ticket items here are the social value, the human value, if you like, the environmental value, but also then how much does it cost? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. And did you do it when you said you were going to? So, you know, all these things. And where digitalisation, I think, comes, I think it takes us to an arena that we have only just entered, actually. It allows us to do so many what ifs and scenario plans for almost zero cost. So, you know, back in the day when I trained, if you wanted to work up 2 or 3 different solutions to a problem, it was actually a big deal. I mean, it was a really big deal because you need teams of engineers, teams of architects, and of course now you need your environmental specialists, you need your social value specialists. So you've got even more people involved than you would have when I trained. But now, actually, so long as we, and I like the word ecosystem, so long as we can broadly use the same ecosystem, so we're using the same sort of fundamental ways of measuring things, we're using the same fundamental sources of data, then now actually get a team of people sat in, they don't even have to be in the same office, sat in their office using compatible systems that can share data. They can run hundreds of thousands of options in the space of a workshop. So instead of, you know, in my day when you could run 2 options in 3 months, you can now run 200,000 options in 3 hours if you wanted to. I know I'm not suggesting you should run that number, but your specialists will be able to, on their own, come up with a sort of broad digital model of what the social impact is, what the cost is, how much steel you need, all this sort of stuff. When you then just tie maybe 10 dimensions of those models together, so I'm not talking about tying every little bit together because you don't need to. At the optioneering stage, you can suddenly see that, yeah, by changing from steel to concrete, it might improve the time scale because steel's on this massively long delivery, but actually our environmental profile's just gone out of the window because, you know, and our social values much worse because we were going to use locally sourced steel, but now we're importing the concrete from somewhere else or whatever. And I think we're just scratching the surface, if I'm honest, of this. So it is sort of, it goes back to the first question I answered. It talks about, you know, the higher levels of BIM or the higher dimensions of BIM. But actually, I think this can be quite simple because you don't need all the data. So, you know, my background's engineering. I work for a cost management company, and so I'm very familiar with the concept of modeling. And that sort of base modeling, so not detailed modeling, but base modeling on, as I said, a few key components, you can get a 10 times better scheme for no additional cost, and it'll probably be built quicker. And I am absolutely convinced of that. So actually, I think digital technologies being used in those early planning, should we, shouldn't we, how do we, stages of a project, is one untapped virtually, not quite. I mean, we are seeing a little bit more of it, but we tend to be seeing it in single disciplines. So you see it with an architect, you see it with an engineer, you see it with an M&E engineer, but you're not necessarily seeing the disciplines coming together. And secondly, I think it's almost what designers want to do, because designers do want to produce the best scheme if they can. So it ought to have a really quick adoption rate once people realise how relatively straightforward it is.
It's interesting that I like to pick up on that theme of that word ecosystem that I think you used and I think Nathan used. And I suppose, do you feel that there's been perhaps a misunderstanding that actually sometimes it's not about building these kind of monolithic data sets, but actually by joining together with various other data sets, you get that bigger picture that enables you to do these?
There's absolutely no question whatsoever about that. I mean, just within our own sort of projects, we've started doing that. And actually, it's really easy to tie together, say, environmental data and cost data. And we know, you know, it's sort of like, once you say, can you do it? Actually, you go, yeah, you're virtually measuring the same thing. You're just putting different sort of units against them, quite honestly. And you can do virtually the same with social value. I'm sure you can do the same with time. I mean, you know, so actually, I think it's possibly looking at it differently rather than needing more sophisticated systems.
Yeah, as you say.
If I could jump in there, Andrew.
Yeah, of course,
building on what Hans just said, the web was built on hyperlinks, right? You know, as long as there's open connections to data sets, by definition, yes, absolutely, we should be stitching them together wherever they sit, and that's fundamental. And a quick shout out as well, because I neglected it earlier too, to the RICS and the ICMS and our standards that, the ICP standards that you guys are working on and that have published, I think, hugely beneficial and influential in putting cost and property performance and environmental data into the models that we're trying to build.
Indeed, thanks. No, it's just there's various sort of examples I've seen where, particularly when you're thinking about the social value and you're putting particularly an infrastructure project into context, that link into geospatial data sets can be so powerful in terms of both positioning with stakeholders and indeed making those links to the kind of data sets that help you make those calculations. So it is that joining islands of data together rather than building these monolithic data sets. So thanks very much for that, Anne. Moving forward, I think back to you, George, now. Our next question is back to the real world. Can you give some real world examples where these advanced digital tools were instrumental in the success of projects?
Yeah, it's a shame. I mean, we've delivered hundreds of projects since I've joined this organisation, and our role is essentially to solve problems. So rather than just say, yes, we're going to go down this route, these are the standards, etc. I think it's just worth noting that when we talk about what is the digital response to an issue, that it is all about working out where the most value can be created and then taking it through that. And I did think about this and just thought, well, well, first of all, what can I talk about where I'm not going to get wrong? But the one that springs to mind for me is an interesting test case is the HMRC Hubs program, which I have presented at a few conferences, but that's nearing its completion, and it's the relocation of many thousands of people, and there's around 10 buildings delivered all through the BIM Level 2 framework, all with one centralized ecosystem of data through a CDE. And what's interesting for me about that is two things. So first of all, the fact that it's, I think I've been on it for about 6 years. So this is a number of different buildings that are being delivered incrementally with a central continuous improvement process, all built around the BIM Level 2 framework as it was set out previously. And in that time, the conversation within the construction sector and through central government has changed. So when all the standards and protocols were set out to start off with, it was all looking at productivity, whereas now the relationship between digital and productivity is slightly expanded, and there is equal weighting to sustainability. So now, as Anne quite rightly put, and as Nathan mentioned just there, we're looking at this. We're looking at outcomes from the BIM process that include decarbonisation, social value, circular economy, and then from a productivity perspective, we're looking at things like modern methods of construction, lean process rationalisation, supply chain performance and culture, and then from a digital perspective, we're looking at the data interoperability, latency of decision making, the ability to link through these key standout objectives that the HMRC as a client have got, link them through the data into sense making and decision making, and actually use the data. And what's fascinating for me is the difference between project one and where we are now. So like each project has become more and more digitally mature, as well as lots of other things that are maturing alongside of it, but they are getting cheaper and cheaper, and we're left shifting more and more in terms of completion dates. And there's loads of stuff going on it, but some of the key things that I wanted to highlight were, first of all, the concept of putting in place a program information management office. So traditionally you'd have like a PMO that manages all of the supply chain and etc. But in this instance, there's an information management office that looks to centralize all of the standards, governance and protocols, and it also centralizes consistent reporting back up the chain. What that's enabled us to do is basically apply assurance and governance of the BIM process across 10 projects in parallel with the similar supply chain, but slightly different. But it's also allowed us to automate a lot of the functions when it comes to bringing the data back up. So for instance, a lot of the sort of executive level reports, previously would often take around a month to filter up to the exec to take a decision on. And through some combination of the CDE, Power Apps, Power BI, etc., just pulling that data out and visualizing it in a way that helps people make decisions, and then also taking out what you'd call like process sediment that had built up over time, different layers of reports. We reduced that from like a month down to about 3 days. So people were able to make decisions on data that was closer to being live than it was previously. And the clients did a lot as well. So they had a digital charter that they rolled out during that process, mapped out sort of personas, user experiences, including the customer, the asset manager, the facility manager, the people who worked in the various different offices themselves. And when you wrap it all up, it's fascinating. You know, you look at this. To start off with, it was, shall we do BIM level 2? And now it's, right, you know, we've got an entire ecosystem of data that's helping us make faster, better decisions based around, I mean, literally the data is pulled directly from the models, which helps people understand the you know, time, cost, quality implications and how that impacts into some of the ESG and sustainability outcomes as well. So, you know, that's the one for me, which you rarely see a project which is government-led at that scale, where you have the ability to actually process and continuously improve and left shift the decisions as it works through, and visibly see the positive impact that's happening from that. And the client, as they've been doing this, have developed an entire ops side stack. So they have a completely different way to approach an asset than they did previously, which is a lot more mature. And we've moved from manual operational readiness and transition to start off with to now automated migration and transfer of trustable data, and the difference is absolutely amazing. So that's kind of like the big one that I'd probably point out. But I would say that putting this stuff into practice reality, there's the academic panacea of what you want to do, then there's the physical, you know, what can we do with the supply chain? We've got the client, we've got the constraints that we've got, and I guess our job collectively as a supply chain support and the client is to reach as far possible as to what their aspirations are whilst managing their expectations. And you have the ability to do that, which is variable depending on which sector you're in. You know, like data center sectors where you've got a lot of repetition, or if you've got big airports where you've got a huge investment pot to roll R&D out and things like that. There's various different constraints. And the big thing for me is conversations like this, and conversations when you bring sectors together to actually talk about the reality of what is being delivered and where the benefits are. And I think that's the big thing that I can see from the digital community in the construction sector that you don't always see from other parts of the sector. I think we're more open, and there's often a focus on that growth mindset that sort of helps transfer that knowledge and information. So I'll just quickly pin something. The digital twin hub, for instance, and I think one of Mark Enza's comments that he made previously was that, you know, one person's case study is another person's business case. I think that's the really important thing about what we need to be doing around digital, is capturing the benefits, capturing the lessons learned, and getting these case studies published. So I get off my soapbox now, but HMRC hubs, there's a few things documented about online, and there'll be more coming out in the future. That's probably the thing that I'd point to where I'd say, you know, it's pretty much got everything that way back in 2011 when the strategy came out, we thought, well, is this the future? It's pretty much got everything in it, you know, including 5D based on NRM and all the rest of it. So that's the key one that I've worked on that I would probably hold up as a good example. There are many more, but that's probably the one.
Thanks, George. Before I move on to our final question, just a reminder to our audience, please do keep any questions coming in that you might want the panel to answer. So moving on, our final formal question, Mohammed, how do you see BIM and digital twins evolving in the years ahead, and how will advances in digitalisation change the way we build? How will that feedback loop actually influence the construction side and design side?
Thanks, Andrew. I think, you know, the timing of this question is great after the last three interventions. I think, you know, the basis to my answer is technology is not the problem, and digitalization is the way forward for the industry. We will continue to say for some time that the future is here, but it's not evenly distributed. We'll continue to say that for some time in the future. Because this is the nature of the construction sector. I agree with what Nathan said earlier, that it's not true that the construction is resistant to adoption. And I stop every student I have, PhD student and master students, they start their dissertation with that sentence, the construction industry is resistant. They say, no, look, this is not true. But we have peculiarities, you know, every project is a different enterprise, a different supply chain. It's really challenging to have a homogeneous digital maturity across every project, across every enterprise. I think this is a big challenge. If you take, so technology, as I said, is not a problem. The process and social aspects are the challenges. They move much slower than the technology. So if you take really any, like if we talk about digital twin and we go to any organization now, they will tell you, we don't know what are the steps involved to adopt a digital twin. We don't have a business case or value. We know there are lots of technologies that make up a digital twin, but we don't know which one to select from. And we don't know what data curation processes we should have in place and what are the requirements in terms of interoperability. So what's lacking really is a framework to guide organizations through that process of implementing and using the innovation. Not my marketing, I'm working on that framework with BIM Academy, so hopefully we'll publish it in a year's time. We have a funded PhD on that topic. Going a bit under the skin of that and talking about data, really is a problem exploiting all that structured data that's becoming available within the industry. Is easier when the organization is independent in terms of owning the infrastructure that collect data and having as well ownership of that data and a data management strategy in place. If you don't have, it's really challenging. Even I can give you an example. I had a funding from Innovate UK project from Innovate UK on understanding the performance of earthwork equipment like excavators. So the earthwork general contractor was partner in our project and receiving grants from Innovate UK. It was challenging for him to give us data because data is not owned by him, it's owned by his employer. It gives you that layer of complication. And also, provided that we had permission from the employer to use the data, we had issue from the telematic systems that they don't allow us to download the data as much as we wish. So you can see there are layers really around that. Having said that, I truly believe, and I'm talking here about from my background as someone with construction management background, I truly believe, like that in future we will have a greater understanding of performance. Performance is a key area. We'll be able to understand productivity rates for machines, processes. We'll be able to understand the operational performance of assets of a boiler. We'll be able to understand the performance of subcontractors. That's actually already possible with some of the mobile BIM technologies. You can track the performance of subcontractor in terms of snags, in terms of problem across site, by level, by floor, by even a work package. It's these things are all possible right now. So provided that we look at how we can nurture adoption within construction, I'm optimistic that digital innovation will change the face of the industry from every facet. It will be more attractive for people to walk in. It will improve its overall performance, and it will ultimately lead to better societal outcome. And to underpin all of those, I would say strategy, training, and education are key.
As you say, so often it comes back to the people, doesn't it, Mohammed, in terms of their awareness and knowledge and appetite and behavioural change, isn't it? Are there any areas where you think there are some technologies on the cusp of being used that will help us that aren't really being explored yet?
On the cost side, how do you say it?
I was saying, do you think there are any technologies within the construction sector in digitization terms that are about to be used, but perhaps should be used more, that are becoming available but haven't really been adopted yet? What's that next wave potentially of technology?
I personally think I'm working in a Horizon 2020 project funded by the European Commission with a Bouygues, is one of the largest contracting company in France, and they have something like like a proper construction site 4.0. I think the ability of the construction industry to use technologies like sensors to develop very well-defined metrics. I call them, construction 4.0 metrics where you really define what's the metric you are measuring, what's the KPI you are measuring, how often, what data you need. That will transform performances within the construction industry, and will also transform cost data. You will be able to really know, like, a certain site with a certain grout condition needs that amount of earthwork equipment. It's going this unit rate. We have done research. We were able to actually predict the amount of earth that can be removed by an excavator. So imagine if technology and AI can help you to collect data as granular as this. You know, it's just a matter of having these technologies widely adopted and widely used, and sort out the challenges around data ownership and access to data.
Thanks, Mohammed. Well, that brings us then to the formal questions. I don't see any more questions from our audience, so it turns to me to thank all of you on this panel for what's been a very interesting discussion. So thanks everybody for your time. Really, really appreciate it. Just a reminder to you, those who are listening and viewing, that we will publish a recording and a written summary of this webinar, as well as the presentation itself. And please feel free to share this with your professional network. If you would take a few moments to let us know what you thought of today's session by completing the online poll. That poll will appear on your screens at the end of this webinar. Please do join us for other webinars in the future. If you please go to the WebF website, you'll see the further details of the webinars that we have upcoming, and you can also watch any of the previous webinars that we've run over the past years and months. Thanks once again to ASITE, our World Built Environment Forum tech partner. And just a reminder that the World Built Environment Forum Global Summit will be visiting Dubai as part of Expo 2020, Dubai in January 2022, which is soon coming upon us. The program will focus on the livable city, agile, healthy and resilient. And once again, full details on our website, rics.org/WebF. For further details on the program. You can continue to follow WebF on our Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn accounts, where you can get news of upcoming webinars, as well as all our recently published articles. And finally, but not least, you can also download the WebF app from the App Store if you're an Apple or Google Play for Android, where you can access the latest innovative global thought leadership content across the built environment. So until next time, goodbye, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew.